What happens when the most powerful man in the city decides to disappear for a day and walk straight into the one person who could make him never want to come back? He thought he was just buying bread. She thought he was just another customer. Neither of them knew that a crumpled dollar bill and one unguarded smile were about to rewrite everything they believed about love. If your heart is already hooked, you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe, hit that like button, and stay close. Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment. The city never really slept, but on Sunday morning, San Francisco at least pretended to rest. The fog rolled in low over the hills, soft and unhurried, muffling the usual noise of ambition and traffic into something almost bearable. Henry Caldwell stood at his floor-to-ceiling window on the 42nd floor, still in yesterday's shirt, holding a coffee he hadn't touched. Below him, the city moved at a human pace. People walking dogs. A couple sharing an umbrella over nothing. The sky was barely drizzling. A kid on a skateboard cutting through a crosswalk like he owned it. He watched them the way a man watches a film in a language he used to speak. The penthouse was immaculate, curated. Every surface chosen by someone whose job it was to make wealth feel effortless. And it did. It felt completely, suffocatingly effortless. Henry set down the cold coffee, walked to his closet, past the row of tailored suits lined up like soldiers, and kept walking until he found the back corner where old things went to be forgotten. A grey Henley, dark jeans with a small tear at the left knee. Sneakers that had actually touched pavement. He changed without looking in the mirror. No driver, no phone calls. He slipped his personal cell into his pocket, not the work one, grabbed a jacket and took the elevator down to the parking garage where he got into a car that wasn't the Tesla and wasn't the Range Rover. It was a 10-year-old Civic he'd bought on impulse 2 years ago and driven exactly 3 times. He didn't have a destination, that was the point. Coal Valley found him the way quiet neighborhoods always find people who need them, gradually, without announcement. He parked on a side street and walked, hands in his pockets, letting the morning pull him forward. The coffee shops he passed were already full of laptops and earbuds. A yoga studio had a line out the door. A bookstore was just flipping its sign to open. Then he smelled it. Bread. Real bread. The kind that doesn't come in plastic. The kind that means someone was up before dawn with flour on their hands and a reason to care. He stopped walking before he'd even registered why, and looked up at the small sign painted in faded gold letters above a narrow storefront. Sunrise Bakery. A little bell rang when he pushed the door open. The warmth hit him first. Not just temperature, but the particular warmth of a place that had been loved into existence over many years. The walls were exposed brick, lined with mismatched wooden shelves holding bread loaves and ceramic jars, and one small chalkboard menu that looked like it hadn't changed in a decade. The glass counter was fogged slightly from the oven heat. 2 small tables sat near the window, both empty. The whole place smelled like butter and vanilla, and something he couldn't name but recognized, something like before the board meetings, before the Forbes covers, before the version of himself that wore armor to breakfast. He approached the counter and looked at the menu. His eyes landed on the bottom item, a plain sourdough roll, $2. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the only cash he had, a crumpled 5 and some coins. He'd forgotten how unfamiliar paper money felt. "The sourdough roll," he said. "Good choice." The voice came from the back before its owner did. Bright, unhurried. carrying a tray of something golden and steaming. She set it on the shelf behind the counter and turned around, and Henry had exactly 1 second to arrange his face into something neutral. "It's the best thing we make and also the cheapest. I like to think that's not a coincidence." She smiled when she said it. Not at him specifically, just at it, at the small joke, like she'd made it 100 times and still found it worth making. He felt something shift, quiet, almost imperceptible, like a door somewhere inside him had moved an inch on hinges he'd forgotten existed. "How much for the coffee?" he asked. She glanced at the chalkboard. "$3.50, but if you're getting the roll anyway, I'll make it an even 4 for both." "That's not how math works." "It is in my bakery." She was already reaching for a cup. Henry sat down at the corner table, the one furthest from the window, closest to the warmth, and watched the fog outside press gently against the glass. The coffee arrived without ceremony. The roll was still warm. He ate slowly, which was something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. When he finally looked up, she was back behind the counter, humming something low under her breath, completely unbothered by his presence. He was, he realized, completely invisible, and for the first time in years, that felt like exactly what he needed. He told himself it was the coffee. That was the story he rehearsed on the drive back to Coal Valley 2 days later, windows down, the Civic making that faint rattle he'd never bothered to fix. The coffee was exceptional, genuinely. He'd had espresso pulled in Rome, pour-overs in Tokyo, single-origin blends that cost more per cup than most people spent on lunch. And yet something about that ceramic mug, that slightly uneven counter, that particular combination of warmth and quiet had stayed with him in a way he couldn't logic his way out of. So he came back. For the coffee, he was lying, and he knew it by the time he pushed open the door and heard the bell and felt something in his chest do a thing it had no business doing. She was there. Of course she was there. It was her bakery. But somehow he'd half expected her not to be, as if the version of her from 2 days ago had been specific to that particular morning and wouldn't repeat. She looked up from the counter where she was arranging pastries on a tiered stand, and recognition moved across her face. Not the kind that came with excitement or performance, just the quiet, easy acknowledgement of someone returning to a place they'd chosen. "Corner table," she said, not a question. "If it's free." "It's always free. Nobody else wants the draft." He hadn't noticed a draft. He sat down anyway. The coffee came before he asked for it, which should have felt presumptuous but didn't. She set it down with the same unhurried energy she seemed to carry everywhere, like someone who had decided long ago that rushing was a choice, not a requirement. "Same roll?" she asked. "Same roll." She nodded and disappeared into the back. He opened nothing on his phone, didn't check emails, didn't pull up the 3 unread messages from his assistant that had been sitting there since 7 a.m. He just sat with the coffee and the sound of the oven and the occasional soft clatter from behind the counter, and something in his shoulders dropped about 2 inches without his permission. He came back the day after that, too. By the 3rd visit, she started talking to him like he was a regular, which, technically, he was becoming. She had a way of speaking that felt like thinking out loud, like she trusted the air between them enough to fill it honestly. She told him the sourdough starter had been her grandmother's, kept alive for over 30 years. She said it like most people said my grandmother left me her jewelry, with that particular mixture of pride and tenderness that only comes from things you didn't earn but feel responsible for. 30 years, he repeated. That's longer than most companies last. She pointed a small spatula at him. Don't compare my starter to a company, it has feelings. Sourdough starter has feelings. This one does. Her name is Gloria. He laughed, actually laughed, not the controlled boardroom version he'd perfected over years of networking dinners, but something real and slightly undignified that surprised them both. She looked pleased in a way she didn't try to hide, and for a moment the counter between them felt like less of a barrier and more like a shared surface. He started noticing things he had no practical reason to notice, the way she pushed her hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist when her hands were flurry, the way she moved through the small space behind the counter like she'd memorized every inch of it, not because it was small, but because she loved it. The way she laughed at her own jokes a half-second before the punchline landed, like she couldn't wait. There was a small scar above her left eyebrow, barely visible, and he found himself wondering about it in the elevator back to his penthouse that evening, which was the kind of thought he recognized as a problem. On his fourth visit, she caught him watching her, not staring. He wasn't careless enough for that, but watching, in that particular way where you think you're being subtle and aren't. She was wiping down the espresso machine, and she glanced over her shoulder and their eyes met, and she didn't look away immediately the way people usually did. "You always this quiet?" she asked. "Usually I'm louder. Different context." She tilted her head. "What context?" He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Work." "What do you do?" A pause. Not long, but present. "Consulting," he said, which was the vaguest true thing he could offer. She accepted it with a small nod, the way someone does when they've decided the answer matters less than they initially thought. She went back to the espresso machine. He went back to his coffee. But the question hung in the air between them, not her question, his answer, and Henry felt it settle into the room like something that would eventually need to be addressed, just not today. Today the coffee was perfect, and the draft was barely noticeable, and she was humming again. That same low tune he still hadn't recognized, and the morning light was doing something generous with the brick walls. He picked up the roll and took a slow bite. He would figure out the rest later. It started with a delivery that didn't show up. Henry heard about it the way he heard most things in the bakery, sideways, without being invited into the conversation. Megan was on the phone behind the counter, her voice carrying that particular controlled calm that people use when they're frustrated, but too professional to show it. Something about a supplier, something about a truck that was supposed to arrive an hour ago and hadn't. She hung up and stood very still for exactly 3 seconds, the kind of stillness that isn't peace but preparation, then pushed through the kitchen door without a word. He should have stayed at his table. He was good at staying at his table. Instead, he found himself standing at the counter, leaning slightly forward. "Everything okay?" She reappeared carrying 2 empty wooden crates, her jaw set in that particular way that meant the answer was no, but she wasn't going to say so. "Delivery fell through. I've got 30 minutes before the afternoon rush and half my display shelves are empty." She set the crates down with more force than necessary. "So, relatively fine. I can help." She looked at him the way people look at offers they want to accept, but feel they shouldn't. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He was already moving around the counter. "Where do you need me?" There was a brief moment where she seemed to calculate something, not about logistics, but about him. Then she handed him a crate and pointed toward the back kitchen door. "Stockroom. Shelves on the left. Anything labeled front display comes out here." The stockroom was small and smelled overwhelmingly of cinnamon and yeast, which was not an unpleasant combination. The shelves were organized with the kind of precision that suggested Megan had a system for everything, and a low tolerance for people who didn't respect it. He found the labeled boxes quickly and started carrying them out, and within minutes they'd fallen into an easy, unspoken rhythm. Him bringing, her arranging, the two of them moving around each other in the narrow space behind the counter, with the careful choreography of people becoming aware of each other's presence in a new way. They were close. The kitchen was not designed for 2 adults moving at pace, and the physical reality of that was something neither of them acknowledged out loud. Her arm brushed his when she reached past him for a jar. He stepped back and his shoulder touched hers, and she didn't step away, not immediately. The air between them had that particular quality of awareness, charged and unhurried, like the moment before weather changes. "You're surprisingly useful," she said, not looking at him. "I have hidden depths." Clearly, she placed a loaf with unnecessary precision. Most people who sit in the corner and observe everything turn out to be either writers or overthinkers. "What if I'm both?" She smiled at the shelf. "Then I'd say that explains a lot." They worked through the rest of the boxes in a comfortable quiet that felt earned rather than accidental. At some point she started talking, not about the delivery, not about the immediate crisis, but about the bakery itself. The way her grandmother had opened it 30 years ago with almost nothing, just a rented space and a recipe book held together with rubber bands. How Megan had grown up behind this same counter, doing homework on a flour-dusted stool, falling asleep to the sound of the oven timer. "She left it to me 4 years ago," Megan said, her voice quieter now. "Which was the greatest gift and the most terrifying thing anyone has ever done to me." "Why terrifying?" She was quiet for a moment, stacking the last of the display rolls with careful hands. "Because the neighborhood isn't what it was. Rents keep climbing. Half the places on this block have already turned into something with exposed Edison bulbs and a $12 matcha latte." She said it without bitterness, but there was something underneath, a weight she carried with the practiced ease of someone who'd been carrying it long enough to forget it was there. "I keep the prices where people can actually afford them, which means the margins are—" She made a gesture with her hand that finished the sentence more honestly than words would have. Henry said nothing. He was listening in the way he rarely listened, without preparing a response, without filtering through the lens of what information was useful, just receiving it. "Sorry," she said, glancing at him. "You didn't sign up for my financial anxiety." "I asked," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment, really looked the way she hadn't quite done before, and something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a small recalibration. Then the last box was empty, and the shelves were full, and she stepped back to survey the display with her hands on her hips. He stood beside her, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of vanilla that seemed to follow her everywhere. Not perfume, just her, just the bakery absorbed into her skin after years of mornings like this one. "Not bad," she said. "High praise." She laughed, that unguarded laugh he'd been cataloguing without meaning to, and turned to grab the empty crates, and their hands reached the same handle at the same time. Neither of them moved. The crates sat between them, their fingers an inch apart, the oven humming somewhere behind the wall, the afternoon light pressing warm and golden through the front window. She looked up. He looked down, and the moment stretched just long enough to mean something before she cleared her throat softly and lifted the crate herself, carrying it toward the back without a word. Henry stayed where he was, his hand still slightly extended, the ghost of almost still present in the air. It happened without a plan, the way the best things usually do. The bakery had closed 20 minutes earlier, and Henry had stayed longer than he meant to, helping stack chairs, more out of habit than intention, the way you keep doing something with your hands when you're not ready for the conversation to end. Megan had locked the front door and was untying her apron when she looked up and said, without particular weight, "I was going to walk through the park, if you're not in a rush." He wasn't in a rush. He hadn't been in a rush in weeks, which was its own kind of revelation for a man whose calendar was usually scheduled in 15-minute increments. Golden Gate Park at early evening had a particular quality that San Francisco reserved for its better moments. The fog still distant, the light going amber and slow, the park half empty in that pleasant way where there were enough people to feel alive, but not so many that you had to perform anything. They walked without a destination, which was something Henry was still learning how to do. Megan walked like someone comfortable in her own pace, not slow, not purposeful, just present. They talked the way people talk when they've stopped trying to impress each other. She told him about the years she'd spent in New York after college, chasing something she couldn't quite name, a career in food journalism, a version of herself that felt more legitimate than a girl from Coal Valley who grew up smelling like bread. "I was there for 3 years," she said, "wrote some pieces, got some bylines, felt like a fraud the entire time." Why a fraud? Because every time I sat down to write about food, all I wanted was to be making it. She kicked a small stone off the path. Turns out the thing you run from is usually the thing you needed all along. Henry was quiet for a moment. Around them, the park offered its soft, ambient noise, distant laughter, a dog's bark, the rustle of eucalyptus in the evening breeze. "I understand that better than you'd think," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "From the consulting world." He caught the faint edge of humor in it. She hadn't forgotten that vague answer then. "From experience," he said, which was true enough. They found a table outside a small cafe near the park's edge, the kind with mismatched metal chairs and a candle in a jar that flickered every time the wind came through. She ordered tea. He ordered coffee because some patterns were hard to break. The conversation moved the way conversations do when both people have stopped managing them, wandering, backtracking, occasionally landing somewhere unexpectedly honest. He talked about loneliness without calling it that. He talked about the particular exhaustion of being in rooms full of people who needed something from you, the way it compounded over years into something that felt less like success and more like a very comfortable trap. He didn't use numbers or titles or any of the coordinates that usually defined him, just the feeling, the weight of it. She listened without filling the silence too quickly, which was rarer than it should have been. "That sounds like a life that looks better from the outside than it feels from the inside," she said finally. "Most lives do." "Maybe," she wrapped both hands around her mug. "Or maybe some people just forget to build a life that's actually theirs." It landed quietly, without accusation. He didn't deflect it. The candle between them threw soft light across her face, the line of her jaw, the small scar above her eyebrow that he still hadn't asked about. She was looking out at the street, something thoughtful moving behind her eyes, and he had the sudden, inconvenient awareness that he was watching her with the kind of attention he usually reserved for problems he needed to solve. Except this felt like the opposite of a problem. She said something then, something small and funny about the tea being terrible, and laughed, and her head tilted toward his shoulder, and for one suspended moment, it almost rested there. The air changed. Her laughter faded into a soft exhale, and neither of them spoke, and the city moved around them like it had agreed to wait. Henry felt it, that precise, delicate wait of a moment, asking to be acknowledged. He wanted to say something true, not about consulting, not about coffee or books or neighborhoods, something that started with "I should tell you" and ended with the kind of honesty that couldn't be taken back. But the candlelight was warm, and her profile was quiet, and the moment was balanced so perfectly on its own edge that he was afraid, genuinely afraid, which was a feeling he'd almost forgotten, that the truth would be the thing that broke it. So he said nothing, and she said nothing. And they sat there in the particular silence of two people standing at a threshold neither has yet agreed to cross, the wind moving gently between them, the night settling in around the edges like it too was in no hurry to interrupt. His coffee went cold. He didn't notice. It was a Tuesday, which felt wrong for a moment like this. Tuesdays were supposed to be unremarkable, the middle child of the week, carrying none of Monday's dread and none of Friday's promise. But the bakery was quiet in that particular late afternoon way, the rush long over, two customers finishing their coffees near the window, and Megan and Henry had fallen into one of those conversations that started about nothing and kept going because neither of them wanted to be the one to stop it. She was reorganizing the pastry case, a task she performed with the focused attention of someone who found genuine satisfaction in small order. And he was at his corner table, jacket off, sleeves pushed to his elbows, reading a book he'd actually brought this time. The domesticity of it was not lost on him. He'd noticed it 3 days ago and chosen not to examine it too closely. "You dog-ear your pages," she said without looking up from the case. "It's efficient. It's violent." She closed the glass panel. "That book has feelings. You and your feelings policy. It's a consistent worldview." She smiled at the pastry case, and he smiled at his book, and the moment had that warm, unhurried quality that he'd started to think of privately as this, the unnamed thing that lived specifically in this bakery, at this table, in her orbit. He excused himself to the bathroom, leaving his phone face up on the table without thinking about it. He was gone less than 2 minutes. When he came back, Megan was standing behind the counter, very still, a ceramic mug suspended halfway to her lips. Her eyes were on his phone. Not going through it. She wasn't that kind of person. But the screen had lit up with a notification, and the lock screen image had done what lock screens sometimes did. Displayed enough. It was a news alert, a business publication, and across the preview, clear enough to read from 3 feet away, were the words, "Caldwell Technologies. CEO Henry Caldwell named to Forbes' annual list for 3rd consecutive year," alongside a photograph of him in a charcoal suit, a glass building rising behind him. The version of himself he'd spent 6 weeks deliberately leaving at home. He saw her see it, The mug lowered slowly. She set it on the counter with the careful movement of someone managing their hands, because the rest of them needs a moment. When she looked up, her face had done something he hadn't seen it do before. Not anger, not shock, but something quieter and more devastating. The particular expression of someone rearranging their understanding of recent events. Megan. Henry Caldwell. She said it the way you say a name when you're testing whether it belongs to the person in front of you. CEO of Caldwell Technologies. Yes. A pause. The two customers near the window were oblivious, quietly finishing their coffees. The oven timer clicked off somewhere in the back. The whole bakery seemed to hold its breath. The worn jeans, she said slowly, not to him, to herself, assembling it. The crumpled cash, the consulting. The last word landed with a precision that made him wince. How long have you been? She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. Was any of it real? All of it? He moved toward the counter and she didn't step back, but something in her posture closed, almost imperceptibly. Megan, I came here that first day because I needed to disappear for a few hours. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't plan you. That's a very smooth thing to say. It's true. So is the Forbes cover. Her voice was steady, which was somehow worse than if it had shaken. There was a control to it that suggested she'd learned at some point to keep the parts that hurt contained. I need to understand what I was to you in all of this. A project, a distraction, something quaint and local that the billionaire CEO found charming for a few weeks. The words hit with the accuracy of someone who'd chosen them carefully, and Henry felt the particular sting of a fair accusation. He opened his mouth, and she raised one hand, just slightly, not unkindly. I think you should go, she said. I'm not shouting, I'm not making a scene, I just need you to go. Let me explain properly. You can explain properly another time. She picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter, a gesture so ordinary it was heartbreaking, the way she reached for routine when things became too much. Right now I have closing tasks, and I'd like to do them alone. He stood there for a moment, his jacket in his hand, the book still on the corner table. Everything about the scene absurdly domestic for what it actually was. He wanted to say a dozen things. He said none of them. Okay, he said quietly. I'll go. He walked to the door and the little bell rang when he pushed it open, cheerful and indifferent to the moment. The cold air of San Francisco hit him immediately, that particular evening chill that the city deployed, like a reminder that warmth was never guaranteed. He stood on the sidewalk. Behind him, through the glass, he could see her still wiping the counter, methodical and composed, not looking up. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Henry Caldwell had absolutely no idea how to fix something, and the worst part was knowing that whatever he tried next, it couldn't be money, couldn't be leverage, couldn't be any of the tools he'd spent 15 years sharpening. The only thing that might work was the one thing he'd been withholding all along. The bakery felt larger without him in it. Megan noticed this the way you notice a sound only after it stops, retrospectively, with the particular discomfort of realizing something had been filling a space you hadn't consciously acknowledged. The corner table sat empty for 3 days. She told herself this was fine, better than fine. She'd known him for a handful of weeks, and apparently she hadn't known him at all, and the appropriate response to that kind of discovery was relief, not the low, persistent ache she kept finding in unexpected moments, while measuring flour, while locking up, while standing at the espresso machine watching the street outside. She told herself the ache was pride. Wounded pride was manageable. Wounded pride had a clean narrative. She almost believed it. On the second day she found the guardanapo. It was tucked under the sugar jar on the counter, not hidden, just overlooked in the chaos of that afternoon. A bakery napkin, the kind she ordered in bulk from a supplier in Oakland. Unremarkable except for the handwriting on it. Henry's handwriting she knew immediately, though she'd never seen it before, precise and slightly angular, like someone who'd been taught to write carefully and then developed their own impatience with the rules. 3 words and an author's name. You mentioned this. And then a title she'd referenced in passing 2 weeks ago during a conversation about books she'd loved and never had time to reread. He'd written it down, so he wouldn't forget, to bring it to her. She stood at the counter for a long moment, the napkin between her fingers, the oven warm behind her, the morning light coming through the front window at that particular angle that made the whole bakery look like something from a photograph taken by someone who understood light. She didn't throw it away. She told herself that was practical. It was just paper. Henry, for his part, was discovering something uncomfortable about himself. He had apologized before, professionally, strategically, occasionally sincerely. He understood the architecture of an apology: acknowledgement, accountability, resolution. He'd delivered them in boardrooms and in emails, and once in a car outside a restaurant where he'd said the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. He knew how apologies worked. What he didn't know was how to want to give one for entirely the right reasons. Not to repair his image, not to recover something useful. Not because the situation reflected poorly on him, or because he needed her to think well of him for any practical purpose, but simply because he had hurt someone who deserved better, and that fact sat in him like a splinter, small, specific, impossible to ignore. He showed up on Thursday morning before opening. No car service, no assistant, no flowers, which he'd considered and immediately rejected as the kind of gesture that cost money instead of something real. He walked from where he'd parked 3 blocks away, hands in his jacket pockets, the early morning fog turning the streetlights into soft halos. He'd stopped at a corner vending machine near the park, the old kind, the ones with terrible coffee in paper cups, and bought 2 because he didn't know what else to carry that wouldn't feel like a transaction. The bakery was dark, but he could see the light in the back kitchen. He stood outside, not knocking immediately, just standing, which was its own kind of statement. The city moved quietly around him. A delivery truck rumbled past. Someone's upstairs window glowed warm and yellow. The fog pressed gently against everything, softening all the edges. After several minutes he heard movement inside, the particular sound of someone who sensed a presence and was deciding what to do about it. He saw her shadow pass the small window in the kitchen door. A pause. Then stillness. She didn't open the door. He stayed anyway. The coffee from the vending machine was predictably terrible. He drank it slowly, standing on the sidewalk in the early morning cold, watching his breath make small clouds in the air. He wasn't performing patience. He didn't have an audience. He was simply, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, willing to wait without knowing the outcome. 20 minutes passed. The front door didn't open. He set the second cup carefully on the step, an offering that asked nothing, expected nothing, made no argument, and walked back toward his car. He didn't look back, which was also new. And inside the bakery, behind the door she hadn't opened, Megan stood very still with her hand an inch from the handle, her forehead almost touching the wood, the sound of his footsteps fading slowly down the quiet street. She stayed there long after the sound was gone, and when she finally turned back to the kitchen, she walked past the counter without stopping, but her eyes moved, just briefly, to the napkin tucked beneath the sugar jar. Still there. The letter arrived on a Friday. Not an email, a letter, the physical kind, in a cream envelope with the property management company's logo embossed on the upper left corner like a small declaration of authority. Megan opened it at the counter during the mid-morning lull, flour still on her forearms, a customer's order ticket tucked behind her ear. She read it once quickly, the way you read things you're hoping you misunderstood. Then she read it again, slowly, and the words didn't change. The lease on the Sunrise Bakery building would not be renewed at the end of the current term. 60 days' notice, as per the agreement. The property owner had accepted an offer from a commercial development group. The letter wished her well in her future endeavors, which was the kind of thing people wrote when they wanted to sound human, while doing something that wasn't. She set the letter on the counter. She finished making the customer's order. She smiled when she handed it over, because the customer didn't need to carry any part of this, and because Megan had learned young that the work didn't stop for your private disasters. You just carried them alongside it until you found a moment to set them down. The moment came at closing time, sitting on the floor of the back kitchen with her back against the oven, warm through the metal, the familiar heat she'd grown up beside. reading the letter a third time as if repetition might alter it. Around her, the bakery breathed its nighttime sounds, the settling of old wood, the drip of the tap she kept meaning to fix, the distant street noise filtering through the walls, the smell of the day still hanging in the air, bread and coffee and 30 years of mornings. Her grandmother had named this place Sunrise because she believed every day deserved a decent beginning. Megan had spent 4 years trying to honor that, and now someone with a commercial development budget had decided the neighborhood had more profitable mornings ahead. She didn't cry. She thought about it, considered the option seriously, and decided it wasn't useful yet. What she did instead was pull out her phone and open her contacts and scroll to a name she hadn't let herself look at in 5 days. She didn't call, but she looked at it for a long time. Henry found out on Saturday, not from Megan, she hadn't told him, which was its own kind of information. He found out the way he found out most things that happened in the city's real estate corridors. Through a call from someone in his network who mentioned the Coal Valley property acquisition as casual conversation, the way people in certain circles mentioned these things as market movement rather than human consequence. He sat with the information for several hours before he did anything with it. This was not his usual pace. His usual pace was assessment, decision, action, a sequence he'd compressed over 15 years into something almost reflexive. But he'd been trying, lately, to put space between the impulse and the response. To ask himself whether the thing he wanted to do was the right thing or just the efficient one. The honest answer, when it came, was complicated. He could solve this. The mechanics were straightforward. A conversation with the right people, a counteroffer, leverage applied quietly in the way that wealth applied leverage when it chose to. He could make this problem disappear before Monday, and Megan would never have to spend another night on the kitchen floor reading that letter. And that precisely was the problem, because solving it invisibly would be the same lie in a different shape. Another version of the man who moved through the world using resources he kept hidden, making things happen without showing his hand, preserving the comfortable distance between who he was and what he was capable of. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He picked it up again, and this time he didn't call his attorney or his real estate contact or anyone in the network of people whose job it was to make his problems resolve cleanly. He called Megan. It rang 4 times. He was preparing for voicemail when she answered, and her voice had that particular careful quality of someone who had been hoping for a call and had also been hoping they wouldn't be the kind of person who was hoping for it. "Henry." "I know about the lease," he said. No preamble. "I heard through. It doesn't matter how. I wanted you to know that I know, and that I'm not going to do anything about it without talking to you first." A long silence. Long enough that he checked the screen to confirm the call was still connected. "Why not?" she asked finally. "Because the last time I kept something from you, I lost the right to sit at the corner table." A pause. "I'd like to not make the same mistake twice." Another silence, different from the first, with a different texture entirely. "The letter says 60 days, she said. "I know." "That's not very long." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The line stayed open between them, neither of them filling it immediately. The city carrying on its Saturday noise around them both from their separate locations. And yet somehow, the distance felt, for the first time in 5 days, like something that could be crossed. "Come to the bakery tomorrow," she said finally. "Before opening." He exhaled. "Okay." "And Henry." Her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more direct, the way it got when she was saying something she'd considered carefully. "Come as yourself. Whoever that actually is. I'd like to finally meet him properly." The call ended. Henry sat in his penthouse, the city spread out below him in its Saturday night lights, and felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, something more fragile than that. Something that needed to be handled carefully, that couldn't be rushed or leveraged or managed into shape. Something that, for the first time in a very long time, he was willing to be patient with. He arrived at 7:15. Not because 7:15 was a significant time, it wasn't, but because he'd been parked 2 blocks away since 6:50 and had spent 25 minutes having a quiet argument with himself, about what it meant to show up as yourself when you'd spent 15 years constructing a version of yourself specifically designed to be shown. The fog was thick this morning, the kind that made San Francisco feel like a city that existed slightly outside of time. He walked through it in dark jeans and the grey Henley, the same clothes from that first Sunday, which was either symbolic or just the most honest thing in his wardrobe, and he decided not to overthink which. No prepared speech, no strategy. He'd written 3 different opening lines in his head during the drive and deleted all of them because they'd sounded like a man managing a situation rather than a man walking toward someone he'd hurt. The bakery light was on. He knocked. Megan opened the door with flour on her hands and her hair pulled back and the expression of someone who had also spent the morning deciding things. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had that first afternoon behind the counter when she'd caught him watching, and whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy some internal question because she stepped back and let him in without a word. The bakery smelled of the first bake of the day. Something with cardamom, he thought, warm and faintly sweet, filling the whole space with the particular comfort of a place that had been woken up with care. The display shelves were half-stocked. The espresso machine was warming. The corner table had 2 cups on it already, which meant she'd made coffee before he arrived, which meant something he chose not to name too quickly. He sat down. She sat across from him, not behind the counter, not at a professional distance, but across from him at the small table, which was the most significant thing she'd done since opening the door. "Tell me," she said simply. So he did. Not the polished version, not the narrative he gave journalists or the biography his PR team had refined over years into something that sounded like destiny rather than accumulation. He told her the actual story. The kid from a mid-sized city in Ohio who'd been good with systems and bad with people, who'd built his first company at 23 out of necessity rather than vision, who'd spent the next 15 years getting very good at being what the world rewarded him for being, and somewhere in that process had quietly lost track of what he actually was underneath it. He told her about the Sunday he'd walked into her bakery, not as a romantic origin story, but honestly, with the slightly embarrassing truth of it, that he'd been suffocating in his own life and had put on old clothes like a costume and walked into the first place that smelled like something real. He told her he hadn't intended to come back. He told her why he had. She listened the way she always listened, without performing attention, without preparing responses, just genuinely receiving it. The coffee cooled between them, and neither of them reached for it. When he finished, the bakery held a particular quality of silence, not empty, but full, the way silence gets when something true has been said into it and the air is still adjusting. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she asked. Not with anger. That had passed, or been set aside, or transformed into something more useful. Genuine curiosity. "Because the moment I told you, I became that again." He turned the cup in his hands. "And here with you I was just a man at a corner table. I hadn't been just that in so long I'd forgotten it was something I missed." Megan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the fog was beginning to thin, the morning light starting to find its way through in slow degrees. "I understand that more than I want to," she said finally. "The hiding part? The part where you find something that feels real, and you're so afraid of losing it that you hold on to it wrong." She glanced at the counter, briefly, instinctively, where the napkin still sat beneath the sugar jar. He followed her glance and understood. "I wrote that down the day you mentioned it," he said quietly. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "I know why you wrote it down," she said. "Same reason I didn't throw it away." The honesty of it landed between them without drama, without orchestration, just 2 people at a small table in a bakery that smelled like cardamom, telling the truth at the same pace the fog outside was lifting. Henry reached across the table. Not dramatically, not with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to commanding rooms, just his hand, open, on the table between them, an offering that asked a question without words. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed her hand in his, and her fingers were warm from the coffee cup and slightly rough from years of work. And when they closed around his, the feeling was so different from anything his carefully constructed life had ever produced that he had to look away for a second at the window, at the thinning fog, at the morning arriving slowly and without apology. "The lease," he said when he trusted his voice again. "I know. We need to talk about that. I want to help. Not fix it. Help. Whatever that looks like on your terms." He met her eyes. "I should have said that from the start. I should have said a lot of things from the start. You're saying them now." "I'm saying them now," he agreed. She didn't release his hand. Outside, the fog had lifted enough that the street was visible, Coal Valley waking up at its own pace, unhurried, the neighborhood carrying its particular mixture of old and new, held and threatened, familiar and changing. A woman walked past with a stroller. A man unlocked the bookstore across the street. The ordinary morning proceeding with complete indifference to the fact that something inside this small bakery had shifted permanently. Megan looked at their hands on the table, then up at him, and the smile that moved across her face was the one he'd first catalogued weeks ago, the unguarded one, the one that didn't perform anything, and it hit him exactly the same way it had the first time, except now it also carried the weight of everything that had happened since, which somehow made it more. "I should finish the bake," she said without moving. "I know," he said, without moving either. The espresso machine beeped softly. Neither of them reached for it. Some people spend a lifetime building walls tall enough to call them a skyline. Henry had, and it took a crumpled bill, the cheapest bread on the shelf, and a woman who smiled at nobody in particular to remind him that the most valuable thing a person can own isn't built. It's found, usually in the last place ambition thinks to look. Megan didn't save him. She simply refused to pretend he was anything other than human. And sometimes, that's the only thing that ever really does. If this story touched something in you, give it the like it deserves, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and tell me right here in the comments what hit you hardest. And if you want more, deeper, more intense, no interruptions, the link is in the first pinned comment. You already know what to do.